Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to explain the Rambam's opinion about the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. In Hilchos Sefer Torah, Perek Shvi, the opening halacha reads as follows: Mitzvah aseh al kol ish v'ish mi Yisrael lichteb Sefer Torah la'atzmai. There's a positive commandment, al kol ish v'ish, every single man of Israel, to write a Sefer Torah for himself. And then he goes on to quote the biblical source for that. The question here is, why does the Rambam mention kol ish v'ish, every single man? What is he trying to say with that? The Sefer Klei Chemda, by Don Plotsky, a student of the Avnei Nezer, he says that the emphasis here is that this mitzvah devolves on every individual. It's not a communal mitzvah, a mitzvah that the community has to provide a Sefer Torah. It's a chiyuv on everyone. The fact that there is an obligation that the tzibur, a community, has to provide a Sefer Torah, that's an added-on obligation, and it may not even be a biblical obligation. The mitzvah, min ha-Torah, the biblical obligation is that every individual should have and write his own Sefer Torah. Now, if you can't write your own Sefer Torah, the Rambam continues that you can have someone else write it for you. Others can write it for you. But we won't go into that. So the Klei Chemda says that the emphasis of the Rambam is that it's a personal obligation on every single individual. And then he says that it could be that the Rambam is trying to intimate that if you write a Sefer Torah b'shutfus as a partnership, it's also not valid. It has to be each individual. And one could perhaps add that the Rambam is trying to negate the next mitzvah, which is that a king should write an additional Sefer Torah. It's a special mitzvah for a king. So here he's saying this mitzvah is for everyone. There's a separate mitzvah for a king. Whatever the explanation is, it's still a little difficult why he has to say kol ish v'ish, every man and man. He could have just said kol ish. And in fact, in the Minyan HaMitzvahs, where he enumerates all the 613 mitzvahs at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, there he really writes kol ish, every person. And that seems to be enough to suggest that it's a personal obligation on everyone. So I don't have an answer why he has to repeat the word ish v'ish, for emphasis perhaps. But one thing is clear, that when he says kol ish, the Rambam seems to be negating a woman, that a woman is not obligated to write a Sefer Torah. Now, it's not just speculation that this is the Rambam's view, although it seems to be clear from the word ish that he uses, but in the end of his Sefer HaMitzvahs, after he discusses all the positive commandments, the Rambam lists those mitzvahs that women are not obligated to perform, and he includes this mitzvah, the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. So the question is, why is it that a woman is not obligated to write a Sefer Torah? We know there's a general rule that a mitzvah, a positive mitzvah, that is time-related, day and not night, weekdays, not Shabbos, and so on, women are exempted from. Women are exempted from tefillin, for example, because tefillin is only by day, or even those who say it could be at night as well, it's only weekdays, not Shabbos. So women are exempted from that. But a mitzvah that has no time constraints, like writing a Sefer Torah, they should be obligated. So why are they exempted from it according to the Rambam? The Shagas Aryeh writes that it would seem that women should be obligated to write a Sefer Torah, but then he says maybe the reason they're exempted is because the reason why the Torah says we have to write a Sefer Torah is v'lamda, to learn Torah, to teach Torah. Without a Sefer Torah, you can't teach the Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah. So since the purpose, the objective of writing a Sefer Torah is for the mitzvah of learning Torah, women are exempted from learning Torah, therefore they're exempted from writing the Sefer Torah. That is what he speculates could be the reason, but then he says, no, it couldn't be, because women are obligated to learn Torah, to learn the parts of Torah that relate to the laws that they have to observe, which is the majority of the mitzvahs. So women are obligated to learn Torah, so why shouldn't the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah not devolve on them? And the Shagas Aryeh does not have an explanation. The Minchas Chinuch actually takes something that Shagas Aryeh suggests but doesn't accept, and he uses that. And he says that there's a Gemara in Gittin that suggests that women cannot write a tefillin or mezuzah or a Sefer Torah. Therefore, the Minchas Chinuch says, if they can't write a Sefer Torah, how could you say they're obligated to write a Sefer Torah? If they write it, it's not a kosher Sefer Torah. And it's untenable to say that the Torah meant everyone else has to write it. Or if they want, they can delegate it to someone else, but the mitzvah is on them. And you could then delegate it, but a woman can't write it. It doesn't make any sense. And the Shagas Aryeh, who suggests that, refutes it. He says, we see mezuzah, a woman cannot write a mezuzah, but yet she can fulfill the mitzvah of putting a mezuzah on the door. The Minchas Chinuch said there's a very big difference, because the mitzvah of mezuzah is separate from the mitzvah of writing it. But here we're asking, is a woman obligated to write a Sefer Torah, and you're saying she can't write one, and yet she's obligated to have it written? If that is indeed the reason why women are exempted, according to the Rambam, we now can understand why the Rambam focuses on this at the very beginning of the laws of Sefer Torah. And he writes, mitzvahs asay, there's a positive command about kol ish ve'ish, and every man, lichtayv Sefer Torah la'atzmai, to write a Sefer Torah for himself. Because one could have suggested that the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah is only an accessory. It's only to enable us to learn Torah. You can't learn Torah if you don't have the material in front of you. So if that would be the case, many achreinim suggest women would be obligated, because they also have an obligation to learn Torah, to do all the mitzvahs in the Torah that they're obligated to do. So if the mitzvah is to have a Torah to enable learning, then women perhaps would be obligated. But the Rambam says, no, the mitzvah is not to have a Sefer Torah. The mitzvah is to write the Sefer Torah. The writing itself is a mitzvah. And of course, that explains why in the count of 613 mitzvahs, there's a one mitzvah to learn Torah, and there's a totally separate mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah. One could argue, why should there be a separate mitzvah? After all, that mitzvah is just an accessory. It's a facilitator to enable us to learn Torah. But no, the Torah says you have a mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah. That means the Torah gives us a commandment to prepare the material that we will later on use for learning Torah. The mitzvah is to write it. And therefore, the mitzvah to write it can only devolve on a man, because only a man could write a kosher Sefer Torah. This answers a question of the Shagas Aryeh. Shagas Aryeh asks, it says in the Gemara Kedushin, the Gemara lists the mitzvahs that are not time-related and women are exempted. For example, Pidyon Ben. It's not time-related. After the 30th day, the obligation continues forever. There's no time at which you don't have to redeem your child after 30 days. And women are exempted from Pidyon Ben. And in that list, that's one of the mitzvahs the Gemara lists, it doesn't mention writing a Sefer Torah. Why doesn't it mention writing a Sefer Torah? If women are exempted and yet it's not time-related, it should have mentioned it. And the answer is, the reason why women can't write a Sefer Torah is not because the Torah exempted them. It's because they can't write it. It's a totally different reason for their exemption. It's not because they would be able to do it, but the Torah exempted them. That's what we mean by exemption. Here, it's not an exemption, it just doesn't apply. I'd like to add another point over here. This is, I think, a big chiddush, but I'm throwing it out. People should consider it. There's a famous dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban about the Birchas HaTorah, the blessing on the Torah. Is it a biblical obligation to say Birchas HaTorah, the blessings on the Torah? The Ramban says it absolutely is. The Rambam doesn't mention it as a mitzvah, doesn't count it in the Taryag. So some say that the Rambam therefore holds it's only rabbinical. Others say Kirya Sefer says no. The Rambam also holds it's biblical, but it's included in the mitzvah of learning Torah, Birchas HaTorah. Perhaps we could say that the reason why the Rambam doesn't count Birchas HaTorah is because it's included in the mitzvah of writing the Torah. What does that mean? What is the mitzvah of writing a Torah? Even if the Torah wouldn't have told us to write a Torah, we'd have to write them anyhow to be able to learn. Elamai. So what is the Torah telling us? That the actual act of preparing a Sefer Torah is an independent mitzvah, independent of its ultimate goal. Even though the ultimate goal is to learn Torah, it's a separate mitzvah. In other words, the Torah is telling us that the preparation for the mitzvah has the same status as a full-fledged mitzvah. Normally, a preparation, let's say we're obligated to eat in a sukkah. You have to build a sukkah. Building a sukkah is not a separate mitzvah. It's included in the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah because you can't dwell in a sukkah if you don't build one. Likewise, over here, you would say that if you don't have a Sefer Torah, if there is no Sefer Torah around, you wouldn't be able to learn. No, the Rambam says that the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah is a mitzvah on every man, not woman. Why? Because the mitzvah is the writing of the Sefer Torah, not just there should be a Sefer Torah. If that's the case, then Birchas HaTorah is the same thing. The Torah, by virtue of counting the writing of a Sefer Torah as a mitzvah, is telling us that the preparation, the enabler, the facilitator is also a mitzvah. And the same thing is true with Birchas HaTorah. What is the reason for Birchas HaTorah? It's to show that the Torah is dear to us, as the Ran brings from Rabbeinu Yaina. Otherwise, it means the Torah has no value to us. It doesn't have the divine value. Birchas HaTorah is an enabler. It enables us and empowers us and permits us, as a matir. It permits us to learn Torah. The same thing as writing a Sefer Torah, even more so. Writing a Sefer Torah, you could not write a Sefer Torah and still be able to learn because there's another Sefer Torah that had already been written. And yet the Torah says that even though it's only an accessory, a preparation, and it's not absolutely necessary, nevertheless it is a biblical mitzvah. Certainly Birchas HaTorah, without which you can't learn Torah, it's a matir, that certainly could be counted as a separate mitzvah, included in the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, which is characterized as a mitzvah to prepare for the learning of Torah.